Hello everyone. In this video I'd like to discuss something interesting, and that is the Arab conquest of Iran. I've actually not made a video on the Arab conquest of Iran. I know that's pretty interesting, but anyways, in this video I'll get to the gist of the Arab conquest of Iran and why the Arabs succeeded in conquering Iran, and what the Arab conquest's impact was demographically, culturally, as well as geopolitically, and on the future of Iran Shah as well. So without further ado, I will begin. So the Arab conquest of Iran grew out of it really resulted, it was the result of, the Arabs, the spread of Islam and the rise of Islam in the Arabian Peninsula, and a desire for the Arabs to spread their religion to new regions and to also conquer and plunder new lands. This was the primary reason, and this was rather the primary factor for the early Arab expansions. It wasn't even, many Arab religionists may say, and Arabists may say that it was really because of Persian provocation and Byzantine provocation which led to the Arab invasions, but this is not true. The reality is that the early Arab wars of expansion were very much aggressive and not defensive in their nature, and these offensive campaigns were undertaken with a desire to loot and plunder and also convert the subjugated populations, and this was the primary reason why the Arabs began their conquests of Byzantine territory as well as Persian territory. Now, prior to the rise of the Arabs, Iran had been very much a superpower, and it was one of the primary global powers at the time. Its armies were very much powerful, strong, and Iranians really mastered the cataphracts. These armored horses which would later make their way to Europe and characterize medieval European knights, armored knights and mounted knights. So really the Iranian military was definitely a strong machine. It was a might. Rather, it was very strong militaristically, and it was a rival to the army of the Romans and the Byzantines, which were obviously the successors to the Roman Empire. But anyways, the issues here were that the Persians had been fighting the Byzantines since 571, and rather 572, and the first, it was a major war, not the first, but it was a long-lasting war from 572 to 591, and then again, just a mere 11 years later, another war broke out from 602, which lasted until 628. And during this war, the second war, Khusru was the primary, he was the Shahanshah of the Sassanid Empire, so Khusru II, and he did a very great job in terms of internal administration, but this war really ended up costing him, and he went a bit too far with it, and I will get into that right now. So during the war of 602 to 628, a usurper, the reason the war was caused was because a usurper by the name of Phocas overthrew Maurice, who was Khusru's benefactor, and this overthrow actually led to previously Maurice had actually helped Khusru regain his throne from another usurper, and once Khusru actually came to power, he ensured he made a great alliance with the Byzantines and established a peace treaty. But what ended up happening was that the primary issue here was that after Maurice's murder, Khusru wanted revenge and he declared war on the Byzantines. Now at this time, the Byzantines were suffering a lot from internal unrest as well, and the Sassanids took advantage. Within a mere 10 years, they quickly overran much of Anatolia, capturing Antioch, Jerusalem, as well as Egypt. Egypt was also conquered, and the Sassanids reached their peak during this period. But what happened was the Sassanids, Khusru rather, he did not want there to be any peace. He wanted to go all the way to Constantinople, and this was a this was a fatal mistake, because what ended up happening was the war ended up being drawn out, and eventually Heraclius, he was another general, supposedly of Armenian stock. He later became the emperor of the Byzantine Empire. But anyways, Heraclius took advantage of this and moved towards the Sassanid Empire and defeated the Sassanids on multiple occasions. Furthermore, the Sassanid Avar siege of Constantinople also failed, and eventually the Byzantines managed to drive out the Sassanids from Egypt, as well as from Anatolia, and ultimately defeat them at the Battle of Nineveh in 627 rather, and this was a decisive defeat. And because of this defeat, there was a lot of internal unrest within the Sassanid Empire, and the Sassanid state was on the verge of collapse. Ultimately, what ended up happening was that Khusru was overthrown and replaced with his son, and his son managed to gather the support of many Persian nobles, overthrow his father, kill almost all of his brothers, and this really led to a lot of instability. His son was Khawad II, and his actions led to a lot of internal instability, and what ended up happening was there was a plague in the western provinces, and that decimated much of the Mesopotamian as well as western Iranian population, and this set the stage ripe for an Arab invasion. And actually, even Purshariati writes in her work on the fall of the Sassanid Empire, she writes that the Parthian clans were actually aligned to, they were part of this confederacy with the Sassanids, and what ended up happening was that they broke away and there was a civil war raging within Iran, and this really allowed the Arabs to capitalize on the situation, because at this point Iran was very, very in a weak state, and the Arabs had the perfect, they were perfect, they had the perfect opportunity to take advantage of the situation, and they did. The early Arab successes in Iran were primarily, in the domains of the Sassanid Empire, were primarily concentrated in Mesopotamia, most notably the Battle of the Chains, which was fought in and around 632, I believe, and this battle was a decisive Persian defeat and a decisive Arab victory. Rather, I think it was between either 629 and 633, but anyways, this battle, it resulted in a decisive Arab victory, and it nonetheless, the Persians weren't really shattered. It was just a minor victory still. The Iranian military was still quite powerful, but nonetheless, this battle opened the way for, the Arab conquest, the first Arab encroachments into Iran. And the Sasanians actually defeated the Arabs at the Battle of the Bridge in 634, and at that point it was a huge and humiliating defeat for the Arabs. Nearly their entire force was killed, and three of their leaders were killed, and it was a major defeat for them. But for some reason, the Persians did not pursue the Arabs, and this really ended up costing them. What followed from this was the unfortunate Arab invasion. The very fact that the Sassanids could not take advantage of this situation led to the Arabs renewing their offensive, and they even managed to capture Ctesiphon in 637. But before that, the major battle which really led to the collapse of the Persian Empire was the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah, which was fought in November 636, and it resulted in a decisive Arab victory. The forces were around even, but the Sassanid commander Rostam Farrukhzad died early, and his death led to a complete collapse of the Sassanid defenses, and ultimately it paved the way for the Arab conquest of Iran. Now, there were a few other major battles which I'll cover now. The Arabs then proceeded onwards into what is today contemporary Ahwaz. They laid siege to Shushtar in 641 and captured it in 642. And during this battle, it was the siege resulted in an Arab victory, and this was a major Arab victory, and it allowed the Arabs to further push into the Iranian heartland. The next major victory for the Arabs came at Nahawand, and that was another major battle. One of the two major battles of the Arab invasion of Iran. One was the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah, the other was the Battle of Nahawand, and it was again a decisive Arab victory. It led to the deaths of both of the Sasanian leaders in the battle, Firuz Khusru and Merdan Shah, and it allowed for the complete, it pretty much was the end of any Sasanian resistance against Arab rule, and yeah, it pretty much marked the end of an independent Persia for the next few hundred years. The Arabs also carried out a notable massacre at the most notable massacre carried out by the Arabs here was at Istakra, where they killed 150,000 inhabitants after the city rebelled. Now, usually the Arabs did not kill civilians. They were not as bad as the Mongols. I think in their whole conquest, out of Iran's 8 to 10 million population at the time, they only killed around 150,000 to 300, 400,000. But still, it was still significant loss of life during the Arab invasions, but nonetheless there were just not enough Arabs to demographically replace or alter the Iranian genome, as all genetic evidence has proven. Now the final notable battle here was fought in 651, and it was the Battle of Ray. And this battle actually was the result of, it was a result of the defection of the house of Ispa Budan to the Arab side, and this was the house of Rustam Farrukhzad. So his brother basically defected to the Arab side and pretty much helped the Arabs in this battle. And it's pretty ironic because towards the end, many of the Persian nobility defected to the Arabs. I know it's really ironic, but by this time the Arabs had full control of Iran. What came up next after these initial Arab victories was that after this, what happened was the situation pretty much deteriorated during the reign of Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan. The Arab language was imposed across the Sasanian territories, former Sasanian territories, and even in Central Asia, the Khwarezmian language was made extinct by the massacres committed there by the Arabs. Most notably, the main Arab leader who committed most of these massacres were Al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf. He was actually responsible for the murders there. And so that's pretty much it. Even Utbah ibn Muslim, Qutayba ibn Muslim later on, he was another prominent Arab who killed a lot of Iranians in Central Asia. But nonetheless, the majority of the Iranian population survived the bulk of these Arab assaults. And even though Iran for these 200 years was in a very dark place, it eventually emerged. But yes, the Arab invasion had a huge negative impact on Iran's culture and the future direction of Iran. But nonetheless, it was not a major blow in regards to Iran's cultural output. Demographically, the Arab invasion changed little in Iran, and most Iranians actually survived much of the carnage which followed from the invasion. And after this, during the Abbasid era, most of the scholars were Iranians, and Iranians achieved a lot, not because of Islam or the Arab conquest, but because of their own knowledge and their own rich tradition, cultural history, and civilization, as their desire to preserve knowledge. And actually, much of Islamic scholarship, so-called Islamic scholarship, comes from the achievements of these Iranian scholars, such as Al-Khwarizmi, Al-Biruni, and also there were many others as well, Nasr al-Din Tusi, Fardausi, Omar Khayyam, Ibn Sina, Al-Razi, and most of these, they were not even very religious in terms of the Islamic sense. They were more so esoteric, and also had many Zoroastrian and pre-Islamic beliefs in their daily, in their worldview, in their religious worldview. The Arab rule in Iran only lasted up for a mere 200 years, after which the dynasties of the Iranian intermezzo rose, and these dynasties came to dominate much of Iran and the Iranian plateau. And Arab rule was always very weak because most of the administrations in the Persian territory, especially during the Abbasid era, were Persians. The most notable were the Barmakids, who were a Persian dynasty of Buddhist origin from what is contemporary Afghanistan, and they played a major role in the administration of the Abbasids. Persians continued to form a bulk of the Abbasid court until the reign of Al-Mutawakkil, and even the majority of even there were many military leaders of the Abbasid. Now this has nothing to do with Arabs. It just shows that even despite the Arab conquest, the Persians managed to maintain their traditions. So again, you had Ali ibn Isa ibn Mahan, who was also a Persian from Iran, from Iranian Central Asia, and he too was a prominent governor in Khorasan. You had Abu Muslim Khorasani, who allowed the Abbasids to rise to power, and there were so many other generals as well. The general who defeated Babak was also Iranian. He was from I think he was from Sogdia, and his name was Afshin. So aside from this, there were many Zoroastrian dynasties which survived, most notably those in Tabaristan, and this independent these independent dynasties in Tabaristan, most notably the Dabuyids, who were the descendants of Gil-Gaubara, who was a Sasanian descendant, descended from the Sasanian Shah Jamas, and minted his own coins in the Sasanian style, and this was a final remnant of the Sasanian legacy until it was conquered by the Abbasids in 760. But nonetheless, cadet branches of this dynasty and of the Sassanids remained in power until the 16th century. So the last one was the Paduspanids, which were conquered in 1598 by the Safavids, and the other one was the Bawan dynasty, which was conquered in 1349. And nonetheless, these dynasties were pretty much centered around Iranian around the Caspian Sea region rather, in Tabaristan, and there were also the Afrasiab dynasty as well. So the Iranian independence movements, as even Zoroastrianism was maintained by the Dabuyid dynasty as well as the Bawan dynasty until at least the 9th century. So yeah, there's definitely that aspect to it as well. What you also have to keep in mind here is that even after these dynasties, the rather even before these dynasties, we had the Samanids, and even before them the Tahirids were the first major dynasty, but they were not independent. They were still autonomous under Abbasid authority. But the real independent dynasties of this time, which were largely Iranian and propagated the Persian language, were the Buyids, as well as there were the Buyids as well as the Samanids, and there were also these were the first major one was obviously the Tahirids, as I mentioned, but the Buyids, the Samanids, the Safarids, the Sajids in what is today Azerbaijan, as well as the Salarids. This dynasty was also in Azerbaijan, but up until between 800 and up to around 1000 AD, Iran was pretty much under nativist control. This was just before the rise of the Seljuk Turks. So yes, this is definitely a period in Iranian history which should definitely not be overlooked and definitely be taken into account. These principalities were very much powerful, and they were the powerful states of Iran Shah at the time, and Iranian, this is why, many people credit Ferdowsi for allowing for the survival of the Persian language, but that was not really the real reason. The real reason was because of these dynasties such as the Samanids as well as the Buyids. They were mostly, they really didn't propagate the Persian language as well, but nonetheless, they did acknowledge it, and it was widespread within the Buyid realm, as Arabic was only restricted rather to courtly rife. So yes, these dynasties were definitely responsible for the survival of the Persian language as well as Persian culture. That's something to take into account here. In fact, until the Mongol conquest, Iran was a major cultural center of the world. Arab settlement in Iran was only ever around 150,000 at the most, and there was no way that this settlement could replace the Iranian population. It only accounted for around maybe less than 1 or 2%, as Iran's population was around 10 to 12 million at the time, just before the Mongol invasion. And most of these Arabs were killed anyways in the nativist uprisings of Babak and Sunpad, and those uprisings led to the deaths of many of these Arab settlers, and most of them were concentrated in Khorasan and Mesopotamia anyway. So they really did not have much of a genetic impact on Iran. Obviously, after this period of Iranian intermezzo rose the era, rather the Turkic dynasties in Iran, so most notably the Ghaznavids and the Seljuks and also the Khwarezmians. But nonetheless, even during their reigns, Iranians dominated much of the native bureaucracy, I mean rather the bureaucracy and much of the governance, as the Turks only had control of military affairs for the most part. And that is pretty much it for my assessment. A final assessment is that the Arab invasion was cataclysmic, but genetically it did not alter the Iranian gene pool, and also in terms of culturally, it did not have a major impact aside from religion, and much of this propagation was carried out during the intermezzo period anyway. So, most of the conversions were during this period, and even before this period, there were not really many changes within Iran, especially in regards to a religious sense. But anyways, the primary changes that did happen happened during this period, and overall, the 200 years of Arab domination, aside from the religious and cultural impact, really did not have a genetic impact. And even Iranians at that time maintained most of their culture, were very secular, not in the modern sense, but just had maintained their traditionalism. Once the nativist dynasties arose, it was not a very strict form of Islam which was practiced. It was very esoteric. Many great Sufis actually arose in Iran. And I think that had the Mongol invasion not happened, Iran today would have been in a very good position, in a very nice, strong, independent position. With the Khwarezmians, you had the unification of all of Iran, all of the traditional Iranian speaking territories, and that was a major, it was a great thing. But the Mongols unfortunately ruined that, and it marked the end of an independent Iran. And unfortunately, it was not until the Safavids that Iran finally began to recover once again. So yeah, that's just it for this video. If you have any questions, please email me at my email, rontalk95@gmail.com. All sources are listed below and in the description and in the comment section. And yeah, that's it about it for this video. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. Please like, share, and subscribe, and take care.